Hello everybody, today we're going to be starting with some basic watercolor practice. These are the 7 techniques that I recommend that you learn first. It's best to get familiar with a few techniques at a time. This approach will make sure you won't feel overwhelmed and you'll get a good result. These techniques are the equivalent of learning how to shade and outline with a pencil when drawing. Just like when you first learn to draw, it is best to leave the color out of it. Think about this as a monochromatic painting. Choose a single color so you can clearly see how you can control the range of that color. I've chosen brown because it's a color I don't use very often, but any color will work as long as it's not a light color like yellow, which doesn't have very much range. To begin, set up your work area. You'll need your watercolor paper, another small scrap of paper to test your colors, some paper towel, 1 or 2 cups of clean water, a mixing palette, a wide flat brush, a small round brush, and your watercolor paints. These can be dried cakes, creams in tubes, or liquid watercolor. A tray of dried cakes of paints are the easiest and cheapest way to get started. To get the paint ready, I'm getting my brush wet and swirling it over the cake of dried paint to get the paint flowing. I continue to stir it until I have enough of the pigment mixed in with that water. Now I'm applying the paint to the paper for the wet on dry technique. Wet on dry is all about getting crisp lines. I'm applying wet paint onto dry paper. With dry paper, the paint does not want to spread or blur, which allows you to get crisp details. Now we're moving on to the wet on wet technique. I begin by applying some clean water onto the area. If I let this be just a little damp, I'm gonna get just a slight blur effect, and if I leave it as a big puddle, I'm going to get more of a swirling and spreading kind of effect. When I tilt the paper, you can see how wet the paper is, or if you touch paper and it's cool, then you know there's still water in it, and you will get a blurred effect. Now I am grabbing some of the paint, and I am doing the same sort of design in this area. As the paint sits, it's going to spread in with that water, which is going to give that blurred effect. You can also do the same thing by applying paint to an area, and then before that paint has dried, painting more details on top, which will blur. Now we're going to be working on how to spread the paint evenly. This is known as the wash technique. So first things first, I need to prepare some paint and set it aside. I can't go directly from the cake anymore because the cake is very inconsistent. Water's constantly seeping in, it's lifting up more pigment, and the darkness changes. So by adjusting how much water and how much pigment is in my mixing palette, I'm going to be able to have a very consistent darkness of color. So I'm just adjusting that here and testing it out on my scrap piece of paper. Once I have the color that I want, I can start applying it to my paper. So I'm going to be dabbing the brush into the well of the painting palette, and I'm going to be tilting my paper a little bit. You don't have to do this, but it is helpful. I am going to be applying brush strokes starting at the top and overlapping them a little bit and moving down the page. If I need more paint, I want to make sure to grab it from that little well that I've set aside, so I'm using the same darkness of paint. I want to spread the paint very evenly, and that tilt to the paper is going to help the paint travel down the page in a very even way. Next, we're going to be talking about the lifting technique. So I'm just applying a very quick, kind of careless wash here, and we are going to be applying different materials into the paint to help lift some of the paint off. This is one of the unique characteristics about watercolor paint. the fact that you can actually take some of the paint back off. First, I'm applying some paper towel, and then you'll also see some toilet paper. The smoother the paper is, the more evenly it's going to lift off paint. But a lot of times the texture can be really interesting. You can even crumple up paper to press into the paint. Here's a cotton ball. The cotton ball had a really nice gradual kind of effect, very soft, which I think would be great for many applications. Also, a Q-tip is really great for just getting into very small areas. And then if you grab a paintbrush and just make sure the bristles are clean and damp, so too much water, you're going to want to dab that off on a paper towel. And then you can go ahead and take that and put it onto your wet areas of paint, and it's going to start to take up some of that paint, which you can then dab off on the paper towel to go back in and take even more paint off. You can even do this to areas that are dried by just wetting them down with clean water and then lifting. Another effect that you're going to need in your paintings is a smooth transition, a gradual transition from dark to light. This is a gradation or a gradated wash. Off to the side, you can see I am preparing some more of the darker paint. I'm going to be working directly from the cake. And then I'm also going to wet down the area that I'm going to apply the paint. I should have cleaned off my brush a little bit better before going into my cleaner cup of water. That first cup is for the dirty brush to go into first, and then when you go into the second cup, not as much paint is going to get into that, so you can keep using the same water for a lot longer. So I've wet down the area, and I'm going to start off by putting that darker paint in there. And I could have used a little less paint here, which is going to be just a little bit tricky to spread around evenly. But I'm applying dark at the top, and then I want to have a nice clean wet brush, but not too wet. So it's better to actually dab off the paper towel right here. And I'm going to take the brush into that painted area and then start to spread that paint down. And as I brush it down, it's going to get a little bit lighter each time, giving me that smooth transition. So I can brush back and forth, moving the paint down into the lighter areas or spreading some of the water up into those darker areas until I get a nice smooth transition. Sometimes you don't want smooth, but you want a little bit of texture, and that's where dry brushing comes in. So first you need to dry off your brush, so I'm using the paper towel, and then I'm getting just a little bit of that creamier paint on the tip of my brush and even dabbing a little bit of the excess off. Now I bring it to the paper and I very lightly touch the surface of the paper with the brush. You can even spread the bristles out to show even more texture. This is really great for grass, hair, or even wood grain. The last technique that you need to know is about controlling how light or dark your paint is, which is done through water. So we're going to be doing a value scale. I am using direct from that cake, getting the darkest that I can get the paint to go. So value is how dark or light a color is, and so this value scale is going to show the range that this color can do. By having the darkest on one side, I'm going to have even steps in between to get the paint lighter and lighter until it is the absolute lightest it can go on the opposite side. Think of this kind of like a ruler, only for colored darkness. I'm using the mixing palette here to take some of that pigment and then diluting it with just a little bit of water to make the value that is just a little bit lighter than what is already applied to the paper. I'm of course testing these on my scrap paper so I can see exactly what it is before I'm applying it to my actual work. This is a really great practice to do with any new colors that you have. I'm going to jump over to the right side of my value scale and start working on some of the light values. Of course, I'm going to account for white, which is going to be the white of the paper, so I'm going to leave some space there. But just next to that, I'm going to be creating a light value. So I've put some water into the well and then dabbed a little bit of paint into it, just a tiny little dab, and that has made a really nice light value. You want to make this as light as you can possibly get it without it being just clear water. Now to get the value to the left of that, I'm adding a little bit more pigment into that same well, which should just darken that a little bit. For your actual painting, it's a good idea to have different values in all of the different wells so you can just keep pulling from the different ones and you don't have to keep stopping to mix up the different values. And as you can see, as I spread this very evenly, it is a little bit darker than the spot to the right. And I repeat the process for the spot to the left of that, making it a little bit darker again. And keep testing out those different values on your scrap piece of paper. It's a good idea to remember that you don't want to apply a bunch of paint all at once. You want to spread your paint very evenly and make sure that you have enough pigment in the paint in the first place. If your paint is too wet, it's going to soak into your paper unevenly, and it can also create lines as certain areas dry faster than others. Now I'm making this paint a little bit darker and applying that to the spot right next to it. I've gone back to that darker value that I created before, and I'm going to just make some adjustments and get it to be just a little bit lighter than the spot to the left, but a little bit darker than what is to the right. I've noticed here that these values are very similar. So I'm going to need to make some adjustments to make it a little bit darker. One way you can do this is by adding layers on top of areas that have already dried. I love to do this to my darkest areas to make them even darker. You have to have a gentle touch so you don't lift up what you've already done, but just a thin layer of additional paint is going to make each of these just a little bit darker. And by doing that to these 3 areas to the left, it is going to make it a much better transition all the way across my value scale. Now I want to quickly fix my gradation. I notice it has dried and formed a little bit of a harsher line, less of a gradual transition. So starting at the bottom with the water, I'm going up towards the top and then coming back down and dragging some of that pigment towards the middle to bring that gradual transition back. Fixing areas like this require you to wet the whole area so that way you can avoid a line being formed between the wet area and the dry areas. And that's it for the 7 techniques that you should learn before doing your first watercolor painting. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'd love to see your comments. Don't forget to visit us on Instagram and share your watercolor paintings with us. And with that, see you again next time.